I know you've been dying to make your own Gandalf hat just like me. Well, I'm here today to show you at Ebony Warrior Studios how to make your own. It's a really simple process, not all that time consuming, but it is a lot of fun. Let's go ahead and get into it. So for a project of this magnitude, obviously you're going to need some fabric. For this project, I chose a flannel, a blue-gray flannel, because we're trying to match the look of the hat from the film, which was actually blue and was weathered over years of use. Next, you're going to need something for the lining on the inside of your hat. I just had some scrap fabric laying around. You'll need an iron to keep your fabrics pressed. And be forewarned that as simple as this project is, it does require a little bit of sewing know-how. Now, this is all dependent on what you have at home, but I would suggest a rotary cutter. It is much easier to cut out fabric with a rotary cutter versus a pair of scissors. You can use Tailors chalk or those white chalk pens or pencils, whatever works best for you to mark on your fabric. And then measuring tape to get your measurements for your head and other various measurements during the project. I like to keep my pin cushion with me at all times because I have stabbed myself with these pens way too many times trying to get them out of the plastic container. You will also need a needle and matching color thread to your fabric. You're going to be doing a little bit of hand sewing for the project. Now, because this is a matching hat to the film version, I have provided my pattern for the brim. We'll be doing a little bit of editing to it in just a moment, but you don't have to worry about creating that pattern. Next up, you're going to need some interfacing. It's what's going to keep the brim of your hat stiff. I used a ultra firm fusible, two-sided fusible interfacing. I've added all the links down in the description for you. Next thing you're going to need is some poly-fil, or anything, any stuffing that you would like to use for the inside of your hat. And finally, you're going to need your hands. You kind of need them for this project. So like I said before, I have provided a pattern for you to use. It is the accurate sizing for Gandalf's hat. What I'm doing here is measuring the previous pattern size of Gandalf's brim. I had made it a little bit too wide, and I'm taking about an inch off of the entire brim. If you did not know, Gandalf's hat is not symmetrical all the way around. His head hole is shifted back just slightly, so the front brim of his hat is about an inch longer than the back brim of his hat. So all I'm doing here is measuring an inch all the way around the outside of the brim of the hat, so that way I can take it off and have the correct sizing of the brim when I transfer it over to the fabric. Now obviously all I'm doing here is marking along the checkered line that I made to get a rough idea of where I need to cut when I make the pattern the correct size. Now this is kind of sort of a no-no what I'm doing here. You don't use your fabric scissors to cut paper or anything else, and you don't use your fabric rotary tool to cut paper, but I kind of cheated. So, since we got our pattern all figured out, first thing I always like to do is get the interfacing cut out. So I take my pattern and place it on top of the interfacing, trying to save as much space as possible, and I need 2 of these patterns cut out of the interfacing. 1 is a little too flimsy, 2 gives it just the right amount of flexibility and sturdiness. Now this is the part where the people who are like veteran master sewers and seamstresses and seamsters are going to get mad at me because I do not know the names of stitches. So at this point I'm just changing the foot on my sewing machine. And like I showed you at the very beginning, I'm going to stitch together the interfacing at this point. and I don't know what the name of the stitch is. I just know it's a zigzag, and I use this all the way up and down the interfacing to keep it together. You need to make sure you do multiple passes on this because you want the interfacing to be stuck together and not able to be pulled apart. So now we're going to move on to the part where we get to put our pattern down on the fabric. I used the chalk pencil at this point because I could not find my Tailors chalk. I find it a lot easier to use Tailors chalk. The part you see here was a lot easier on flannel than it was on the bubble gauze cotton that I used for Gandalf's tunic. That was a much lengthier process because of how flexible and stretchy that bubble gauze cotton was. I will say on this portion, take your time and make sure that you accurately represent the pattern because you don't want one side lopsided or a little bit bigger than the other on your hat. So for this next part of the project, we're getting our seam allowance. It is 3/4 of an inch around the perimeter of the pattern. Now you don't want it to be too big because then you'll have a baggy floppy hat, and you don't want it to be too tight or too small because I had that issue with one of my previous hats and I was not able to get enough of the material to come out of the over the brim of the hat so I could sew it to the cone itself. So 3/4 of an inch is enough to give you that seam allowance. I just marked it on a piece of tape and then cut that piece of tape to the correct size, and I'm able to move that all the way around instead of having to do a ruler. It makes it much simpler. One thing I forgot to mention is that I have folded the fabric over on itself, so it's 2 layers of fabric. So all I need to do when I cut it out is cut out one side, and it's going to give me 2 pieces, which I require to make the brim of the hat. Draw around the lines that you already made to create your seam allowance. Now when you lay your pattern out, you should have a perfect 3/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around your pattern. Next thing you're going to do is just cut out your fabric with the lines that you've drawn. And like I said before, you have 2 layers of fabric, so just be careful so that way you can get both layers of fabric cut out equally. I gave myself a little bit of leeway on the inside pattern because when I did version 2 of the hat, I did not give myself a large enough seam allowance on the inside. And when I was trying to sew the cone on, I didn't have enough fabric. It was not good. But I will note that when I finished this hat, I did give myself a little bit too much of a seam allowance. So, you know, you live and you learn. That's why we're going to do a version 4 later on. Next up, we're making the cone of the hat. Now, for an accurate cone on Gandalf's hat, you want it to be at least 23 inches long. So I am giving myself a 23-inch cone and using my Tailors chalk to mark off my fabric, the 23 inches. You can see that the fabric is folded in half. You want to butt up against the folded edge of your fabric and then mark your 23 inches. Now this next part is actually pretty fun because it involves some geometry. Because my ruler had a hole up at the top, I'm just putting a pencil in there so that it can swing along a pendulum. And at that 23-inch mark, I'm lining it up with the mark I made at the bottom of the fabric, and then I'm just swinging it like a pendulum and marking along to create the curve that I will have for the bottom of the cone pattern. Now, dependent on how much of a slope you want on your cone, on your hat, you will need to create a secondary line just a few millimeters below the original curve, and then join this new line into the curve. That will give, once you're sewing the hat onto the brim, will give it a little bit more of a curve or a lean back to it. Now, because I did math earlier, I already knew what the inside diameter of my head hole was, but I'm just showing you an easy way to get that inside diameter. Just take your pattern, fold it in half, and then take your measuring tape. This is a cheating way, and you can get that inside diameter. It was about 14.5 inches, the inside diameter of that hat. Then all you're going to do is take that measurement and go along the curve at the bottom of your cone and measure the 14.5 inches, whatever the inside diameter of your hat head hole is. You're just going to measure that along the curve and mark it off. And then you're going to take that particular mark, use your ruler, and draw a straight line up to the tip of your cone, and that will give you your cone pattern. Now, the same exact thing that you did for that first cone pattern, you should not have to do it for the inner lining of your hat. All you need to do is cut out the first pattern and then place it on top of whatever your secondary fabric is for the lining of your hat. And I would suggest carefully drawing an outline onto that secondary fabric instead of cutting around your previous fabric to cut out the second fabric. Oh look, we have all our pattern pieces done. So now we can start assembly. What you're going to do is take your brim pieces and separate them, and we're going to have the outsides facing inward towards each other, and we're going to start pinning the fabric together for sewing. Now, when I say the outsides facing inward, whatever side you put your seam allowance on is the one that you want facing outward. You can see it here. The seam allowance is showing. So I'm going to start pinning, and then I'll be able to sew it all together. Now, when sewing the pieces together, I left about a 1/2 inch of a seam allowance with my stitching. For future projects, I'm probably going to do a 1/4 of an inch or closer to that chalk line, but the furthest you want to be away is about 1/2 inch. Now that both of your brim pieces are sewn together, you're going to cut off the excess using your rotary tool. Get as close as you can to that stitch line, but do not cut that stitch line. I've had that happen one too many times. I'm a broken home. I gave you all the bricks that I own and know. Wanted to see how close I could get to that stitch line, so I went over it again. I actually got pretty dang close. But if you wanna travel, then go alone. Yeah, what's the point in us if I never know? Yeah, if you're gonna leave, I'ma let you go. The main reason that we cut off that excess fabric is because Gandalf does not have any noticeable seams in his hat. So we need to iron down those seam lines so that way they do not show up when we sew everything together with the interfacing. Now this part is incredibly important. You're going to start putting the brims together. You need to make sure that the back seams are lined up with one another, and with the fabric right side facing in, you need to start pinning around the outside of your brim. You need to make sure you're taking your time and pinning them together properly, because you will get bunching or overlap if you don't do it right. So just take your time and enjoy the process. Do not stick yourself with any of the pins. I do it a couple times and it does not feel good.
is what I tell myself, so I could feel something else. Yeah, I guess I had my bad days, but it doesn't mean I lost my style. Darling, where were you when my heart was on the ground? I thought time would prove that you would stick around. I guess time stands still, a king without his crown. Now I'm breaking, you're faking, girl.
Once you have the entire brim pinned, you're going to sew all the way around the outside of your brim. Again, this part needs to be done very carefully. I like to line my foot up, the outside of my foot, with the outside of the fabric, and to make sure I maintain that line all the way around the fabric. Wash, rinse, repeat. Again, we're taking all the pins out, and then we're going to cut around our seam allowance and cut off the excess fabric. This will help us when we turn the entire thing inside out and we're trying to create that seamless look of Gandalf's hat. Now, once you have all of that excess cut off, you're going to flip the brim inside out. And you're going to want to do your best to tuck out that seam along the side. This part is a little time consuming, but take your time and it will look fantastic in the end. You want to make sure that seam is not bunched at all. You got to pull it out, push it out, whatever you need to do. I actually go in and I iron the seam all the way around to make sure that it's flat. Now is the fun part. You got to stuff your interfacing into your brim donut. Do this carefully. You want to line up the back seam of your interfacing with the back seam of your actual brim. Now, because this is fusible interfacing, you can iron the fabric and it will become fused to your interfacing. So before you can do that, you want to make sure that the seam of your brim is lined up with the edge of your interfacing. You're going to have to go all the way around the hat and work that seam to make sure that it is lined up properly with the edge of your interfacing before you start the ironing process. Because once that fabric is fused to the interfacing, it is not going anywhere. So this process, honestly, probably the most important of the entire bit. You need to make sure that it's lined up properly so that way you don't have any bunching, and so that way your seam allowances when you're sewing your cone on are lined up properly. Now the brim head hole should look something like this on a 24-inch head. Wash, rinse, repeat. Obviously you want the outside of your fabric facing inward, and we're pinning up the pieces for our cone so that way we can get it sewed closed. As before, line up the outside of your foot with the outside of your fabric and sew away. Everything sewn up, it's the same process again. Cut off the excess on the sides, and then for the inner lining, I'm cutting the very top off of the cone because that's where I will fit my hand through to put any stuffing for the inside of the hat. We will not obviously be doing that for the outside of the cone. I'm just going to go along here with my rotary tool again and cut off the excess. I made a mistake here. I should not have used the ruler because I got way too close to my stitch line. So you can see there are a couple of holes, and I went in and I hand stitched to close up those holes. So don't make my mistake. Once you have all the excess cut off, you can flip the outer cone inside out. Use a pencil to push out the very tip of the cone, but you want to make sure all of that fabric is flipped inside out. So that way when you put the stuffing in, it does look correct. Gandalf has a very defined point on the end of his hat. It's not curved or anything, so you want to make sure you take the time to get the very tip of the point of the cone to come out all the way. This next part takes a little bit of patience, but what you're going to do is flip your brim upside down, and you're going to match the back seam of your outer cone and inner cone. Obviously, first you're going to put the inner lining cone within the outside cone, and you're going to line up all that fabric. Then you're going to line up the back seams, and you're going to start pinning everything. So your cone with the brim facing upside down, your cones should be facing downward. And you're going to line up. You should have 4 layers of fabric that you are pinning together. You should have the upper and lower fabric of your brim, and then you should have your outer cone and your inner lining cone. Everything should be lined up. So you can see that I'm going around grabbing all 4 pieces of that particular fabric, and I'm making sure that there's no bunching, and I'm pinning all the way around the brim of my hat, because after that's done, then I will be hand sewing the brim to the cones.
But it's not like I need it, and you may have some history, but we don't have to repeat it. You made this mess and left me with the pieces. Now I'm gonna burn all the bridges between us. I can't focus, I can't forget. I've been thinking too much lately. I just need to clear my head. I just need to clear my
You have all that fabric pinned together. It should look something like this.
I just need to clear my
Next up, if you have eyes that are good enough to do it, thread your needle with matching color thread or similar color thread to your hat. Now, I apologize for this part being out of focus, but I did the entire hand sewing process and the battery of my camera died, so I didn't get to show you how I sewed it, but it's just a simple stitch all the way around on the inside, and this is what the hat looked like once it was all sewn together. So I doubled over the fabric on the inside of the brim. It gave it a really nice little look on the inside when you wear the hat. So that's everything sewn together. Next thing that I like to do is take my hat and I will look at whatever reference I have for Gandalf. There are different ways that Gandalf's hat is represented in both the films and different media. For the statues or video games, the action figures for the Lord of the Rings series. So whatever interpretation of the curve of his hat you want to do, it's personal preference. I personally like the way that his hat is shaped in The Hobbit, and that's what I was trying to go for here. I'm stuffing the tip of the cone first, just so that way I can get that kind of like curvature at the very end of his hat in The Hobbit. This part's pretty easy. All you're going to do is use your hand on the inside of the hat and fold it, pinching down, trying to be as straight as possible. But you're pinching down on the inside of the cone, and then you're going to go in and hand sew little stitches to keep the curve in place. You just want to go through the bottom of your fabric and out the upper piece of fabric that you're holding, and just do, I don't know the name of the stitch, but a circular motion to close up that little stitch. And because you're using smaller thread, you should not really notice it or see it unless you get super close to the hat. It's really an illusion to keep that hat with the curve. There are other ways of doing this. You can make a structure for the inside of the hat using like EVA foam or something like that, but this method is a lot simpler than having to make a rigid form, and it's easy to get back into that shape if you accidentally smush the hat or you have to ship the hat, anything like that.
Sleepless nights I laid awake just begging to let go. I almost got to suicidal thoughts, but you stepped in and
when you're creating these bends and folds in the hat, Gandalf has these really cute looking creases in his hat, so you're trying to replicate those by making those folds and bends on the hat. It's just honestly looking at reference photos and trying to replicate that with the little stitches that you do on the back of the hat. If you can't perfectly replicate them, it's fine. It's going to look much better once you start adding stuffing to the hat. The creases start to come out and you can, iron or pinch the folds, whatever you need to do to get the particular creases that you want in the hat. So just to reiterate, you want to make the pinned or stitched curves in your hat first, then you want to go in with your stuffing through the hole in your inner lining and pack the inside of the hat, but you don't want it fully packed. You want it to give the cone some shape, but your head is going to give a lot of structure and shape to the hat when you actually wear it. Do adjustments as you work and test it out in the mirror to make sure you're getting the shape and silhouette that you want for your hat. Do not rush. Once you're done stuffing and shaping your hat, you get to wear it and show it off. Now this is version 2 of the hat. That was not the correct color. And I am wearing the version that we just made. That is version 3, more accurate to the film, and much more comfortable with the flannel. Now, like I said before, I did make a couple mistakes here and there that I will be correcting in a version 4 of the hat, but this is the overall process of making a Gandalf hat for yourself. So it's very fun to do, very easy to do, and I hope that you all will show me the versions that you make of Gandalf's hat. I hope to see you and your creations on my journeys through Middle-earth. And as always, this is Ebony Warrior Studios with blinding speed, master quality, untold savagery.